Hello and welcome. I'm so excited to be with you this beautiful Wednesday afternoon here in the study. I'm Abby Samson, and this is the Samson Historical Channel. Make sure you subscribe to get our notifications as we meet here every Wednesday afternoon at 4 p.m. And we're going to talk about some exciting things. If you were with us for our first video, first of all, thank you very much. And we hope you learned something really cool about one of my favorite things, which would have been the clay pipes. Tonight is going to be a little bit different of a video. We're going to talk about quite the character, and her name is Mary Toft. And the reason that this story is relative is because she made news, even for the common person, broadsides, newspapers. This was something that took the world by storm. This was entertainment. And I would like to kind of set the scene as we go into this here with a little poem that was written about Mary Toft and the experience. And that is, poor Mary Toft in ignorance was bred, and never betrayed a deep designing head. Never seemed cut out for plots, yet never did wife like her impose so grossly on man midwife, who scorning reason, common sense, and nature, place all their faith in such a stupid creature. So, as we go through the story, I will say that I heavily disagree that Mary Toft was, by any stretch of the imagination, stupid or unintelligent. She holds on to quite the scheme. So I will go ahead and say, for those of you that know anything about this story, it's one of those that there's many layers to, and there's always more, and it's a bit bizarre, but it's one that's very kind of can't look away interesting. So she was actually born Mary Denier. And she was described as short and sullen and coarse of features. So not super kind, just kind of average and ill-tempered. And when she is 17, she marries Joshua Toft, who is 18. And they're living in just this little town called Godalming in England. And if I mispronounce that, I am very, very sorry. Please correct me. We were dealing with English, French, and German names in this, so I ask you to be kind, to be forgiving. I'm doing my best. In the story of Joshua and Mary, first of all, disclaimer, no rabbits are harmed in the making of this video, but they very much were harmed in the making of Mary Toft. So you've been warned as we go ahead. But Joshua is a journeyman clothier, and a really bad one. He is not successful at all, despite their town being a major stop on the way to London. So I don't know if Joshua's skills are lacking, bad luck, I'm not sure, but he's having a really hard time supporting Mary and their two surviving children. They did have 3 children, 2 survived infancy. And now we get into, April 23rd, 1726. Mary is 25. So there's not a lot known about Mary and Joshua early on because they really weren't anything spectacular. They were poor, not doing well, not good at his job. And so Mary takes on work as a servant. So she's going to try to help make ends meet, help support their children. She is at this time reportedly about 5 weeks pregnant with their 4th child. So she's acting as a servant. She's out in this, some people say field and some people say wood. So the story that she's out in the field, she's weeding and maintaining and tending that way. In the wood, she's gathering. So this is a story that's been blown up way before our time here. It has definitely been exaggerated and changed a little bit. But either way, she is startled by a rabbit. It jumps out at her, and then she runs and chases it because she's like, man, that would be a really good dinner. She's not able to catch it. And this is where the nasty rabbit pregnancy cravings set in. She reports that she is craving, stewed rabbit, roasted rabbit, any kind of rabbit. That's what she wants. But her and Joshua can't afford to go buy a meat rabbit. Clearly they can't catch one because on top of being a poor clothier, Joshua also is apparently not a good hunter. And Mary couldn't catch the rabbit. I don't know that I could have caught it either, to be honest with you. And But we're going into this, and then shortly after this, a couple months later, she ends up getting ill and losing the child. And at this point, she's still really, really fascinated with the idea of, I need a rabbit, which if you've had pregnancy cravings before, I get it. I really do. Not for rabbit, though, I will say. But so she gets sick. She's reported as colicky. And even though in theory she's lost this child, her symptoms persist. So the distended abdomen, the cravings, all of that still continues, which is odd to begin with. And so on September 27th, again, this is in 1726, they call a midwife. And there's a little bit of skepticism on who they call first. Her mother-in-law in the same town, her name's Mary Toft, was actually also a midwife. And then the neighbor assisted as well. But then some people say that they called John Howard, who was in the town over. It makes more sense to me that they called her mother-in-law first, who's right there. And Mary gives birth to what is the first of many strange things, but the lights and guts of a pig is what's reported. And so that's very confusing. And regardless, at this point, they do call John Howard, and they're, Mr. Physician, can you come and figure out what's happening here, because it's very odd. And so John Howard was in Guilford, and there's not a lot known about him, what I call the pre-Toft period, and except for the fact that he's a well-known and a well-respected midwife and obstetrician. He's just going along, running his practice, not really creating any waves, until Mary Toft lands on his doorstep. And so he gets there in time for her to pass some more pig parts, and what he sees is concerning to him. He's like, I'm not sure what's going on. So he keeps an eye on Mary, who then a couple weeks later, mid-October, then gives birth to the paws and what looked like to be the head of a very small cat. Now, looking back at the whole story, a lot of people believe that it was a premature rabbit born of a rabbit, and just very small. And so this cat is born, and that's the first. After that, the first confirmed rabbit comes, and so that's a few weeks later, but it's severely dismembered, so it's coming out in pieces. And I'm sorry, I told you this was going to be a rough one, guys. And Howard reports that he can feel them jumping prior to being born. So that's obviously a bit concerning. And so he starts writing his colleagues. And some of them are writing back saying, this is a hoax. Like, she is playing you, which I'm sure is what everybody here is thinking. And if you're not, very sorry, your bubble is going to be burst here. But they're telling him it's a hoax, and others are saying, but wait, do we remember back in the 16th century where we had this idea, and that was called maternal impression and maternal imagination. And John Marbury, who is a physician and was a well-known physician, had actually published 2 years earlier a book over the idea of maternal impression and imagination. And so what this idea is that if the mother thinks about something hard enough, those thoughts affect the baby. And it goes back and kind of, he combines it with a belief of something that's called a suderkin, which comes from Dutch, and there were small braziers that women would heat their skirts on and such, especially in the winter. And that if you did that for too long, you'd give birth to a suderkin and not a baby. And it was this mouse-sized monstrosity. But John Marbury in the maternal impression takes it a step further. So if you think about something hard enough, like rabbits, you can give birth to a rabbit. And this is a really big catch-all for any type of birth defect, is to say, well, the mother thought this or this happened, and that's kind of how you explain away what you can't explain. And so it also includes advice like, don't spend too much time with your pets. or your children will come out with the features of your pet. So obviously there are some flaws with this logic. I don't know that I need to lay them out for you. I will say that our daughter would have been born a macaroni noodle if this was a real thing. But either way, John Mowbray is actually still really respected, and he's pulling from these old ideas and combining them with newer ideas, and he's saying, I have an answer. I know why this is happening. And Mary Toft is like, wow, yeah, that makes sense. And so he comes to see her because absolutely she's supporting everything he's researched, right? And so after 9 rabbits in a single day, not partial rabbits, 9 whole rabbits being born in a single day, Mowbray and Howard move Mary to Guilford. So they're moving her to be closer to them. I will say at this point, there's no record of where her other children are. Nobody ever mentions them again. As far as I can find, nobody mentions them going with her. Sometimes her husband's mentioned being at some of these different places with her as she's moved around. But to be fair, I don't know what happens to them because everything focuses on Mary and her rabbit children. And so November 15th, 1726, King George I hears about all of the stuff that's happening. And they say, well, what do? We need to figure out if this is true or not. Like, if this is real, this is quite the oddity. We need to bring her here. So he dispatches a couple of people that he trusts. And the first one of those is Samuel Molyneux. And he's already a well-known scientist. He is known especially for his work on telescopes. But he's a man of science in his own right. And then with him, you have Nathaniel St. Andre, and he's a surgeon to the court. He's very well known, very well respected. He's treating the king and these other royals. So, we trust his opinion. And St. Andre actually writes a detailed account of his time with Mary Toft. So we get to see kind of his notes on that. And they arrive just in time to see the trunk of a rabbit delivered. Just the upper torso part is delivered. And so they take notes, like, well, that's awfully strange. And I'm going to read a quote here that says, which the heart and lungs were entire contained in the diaphragm. I instantly cut a piece and tried them in water. They seemed but just specifically lighter than it. And Mr. Molyneux, pressing them into the bottom, they rose again very slowly. Can you guess what that means? This very simple test means that at one point those lungs contained air. And so they're like, well, it's a bit odd, but we're gonna keep going because there's explanations to everything here. And this is it. This is a way to publish it and make your name. You'll be famous. The doctor to Mary Toft who delivered these rabbits. And so shortly after, he gives an examination, and both St. Andre, Molyneux, and Mowbray, and Howard, they all noticed that there was an odd shape to part of her reproductive system with her fallopian tube, and they're like, well, clearly that's where the rabbits are coming from. And so everything in their minds, when they're working off of this already kind of maternal impression theory, they're lining it up and kind of ignoring the things that are saying, this probably isn't real. So then the back half is delivered, and that contains actual pellets still. After that, the head, and then separately, the entire skin of the rabbit. All these are delivered at different times. And after each time, Mary gets up, walks herself over to a chair. Cheerful and easy was described as her temperament in these situations, and is examined, and they can find no reason for the rabbits. And after they send things back, and these notes back, like, we don't know what's happening. We think it might be real. The Queen Caroline actually sends over her suggestion, which is Syracuse Allers. I'm sorry, my German is rusty. who's a German surgeon for the court, and he's already very skeptical. He arrives and he's already there to prove her wrong. And he asks Howard these questions, and Howard's giving him answers, and he's kind of torn, like, okay, maybe this might be real. And he dissects a pellet. It contains corn in it, so this rabbit has eaten corn and other grains, and that doesn't sit right with him. But he keeps it to himself, and they keep experimenting, and more rabbits are born. At this point, we are up to 17 rabbits, which is, it's a lot. That's a lot of rabbits. And along with this surgeon comes another surgeon named Richard Manningham. And he's actually an obstetrician by trade. And he becomes kind of the hero of this story, in my opinion. Richard Manningham is not a man who is easily duped. And he is not going to put his career on the line for the likes of Mary Toft. He's already got a good reputation. He doesn't need the fame. Whereas you have what essentially is the small country doctors that do, and are looking to kind of raise their station that way. And so what he saw when he got there, he actually missed the birth of any rabbits when he first got there, but did see her pass what they described as an article from previous birth. But what he saw and thought was, that's a hog bladder. And so he examines it next to another hog bladder, and he's like, no, this is definitely a hog bladder. So he keeps that to himself. He packs Mary up, takes his bits of hog bladder, and they go to a public bath in Leicester Fields in London. And he calls his friend Dr. James Douglas. So all of this can be found in a detailed account written by Manningham. A lot of these doctors are writing different notes, and they're publishing them in newspapers. So people are already hearing about these. They're writing to everybody they know, getting opinions, and saying, do you support this? Will you support my writings? And putting together basically these different pamphlets to convince people that this is either real or not. And the public's eating it up because it's a sensation and it's entertaining. And so he calls his friend Mr. James Douglas. At this point, Mary has a massive infection, and it causes her to lose consciousness frequently. She's very, very sick, but is continuing to birth rabbits in full and in pieces. But her luck does tend to kind of run out here at a point. So Manningham and Douglas are already thinking, okay, we've got this written up. We're going to publish this, and we're going to say that she's a fake, and here's our evidence. But St. Andre and Howard have already said this is real, and here's why, and they convince them not to publish and to hold on to their findings, which works until December 3rd of 1726. And so Thomas Howard, who's actually a porter, not to be confused with Dr. John Howard, he was a porter where they're staying, gets caught smuggling in a rabbit. Mary says, I wanted it to eat. Well, she didn't tell anybody else that she wanted to eat. And the porter, Mr. Howard, is already confessed. He's saying, no, she paid me to bring her the smallest rabbit I could find. I don't know much about cooking rabbit personally, but I assume you don't want the smallest one you can find. Seems counterintuitive. So he admits to being bribed, and Mary says, I won't confess. Until Dr. Manningham suggests, well, there's always this experimental surgery we can do. And rightly so, that very much scares her, and she says, okay. I did it. It was a fake this whole time. And this has been going on for months. Absolute months. Which is why I think you can't say that Mary Toft was stupid, because she's fooled a lot of people at this point. Some of them are willfully being fooled. But she's created and gone on with quite a hoax. And so December 7th, 1726, she confesses to James Douglas and Richard Manningham, yes, I did this. I had a pouch in my clothes, and when people weren't looking, I would then prep the rabbit and give birth to it. So how nobody noticed in her clothes that there was a pocket where she was keeping rabbit parts isn't itself concerning to me. But here we are. And then the next day she continues to give this confession. And her mother-in-law, Ann Toft, who was the midwife who assisted her first, the organ grinder's wife, who is said to have come up with this whole plan, according to Mary, and then, in fact, Dr. John Howard himself, she implicates each one of them, saying they helped her, they smuggled in rabbits. The organ grinder's wife actually was responsible for helping her prepare the first rabbit and the pieces of it that were born. And that I believe was the neighbor. And it was her idea. And the whole point of this was to get money. So she's selling her story. And now she's getting fed by these doctors who are, they're already examining her, and they need her in good health because they want to figure out what's going on with these rabbits. So it's a really pretty sophisticated plan at this point. So the court does charge Mary Toft on December 9th, 1726. And that's under the statute of Edward III for, I love this, and it's an exact quote, for being a vile cheat or imposter. They don't make verdicts like they used to, do they? A vile cheat or imposter. And she was taken to Bridewell prison. And that's she was supposed to stand trial, but a trial was actually never held. They're like, we have a lot of evidence here. We have your confession. There are actually written confessions for this, and then later charges that they have written from her neighbors that are published into a book. And I'll put the link to that book because it is great reading. And it's a big circle of pointing fingers, ultimately. But it's very entertaining. It's short. But this pamphlet was published, including Mary Toft's confession as well. So she never ends up standing trial. And then ends up being released from Bridewell, but then goes back to her hometown and is put in the gaol there. And this time for receiving stolen goods, though she is acquitted of that. She did pay for all the rabbits that she took. And the reason she got away with it for kind of this long is A, she left her hometown very, very quickly. And B, her husband was going out to her town and surrounding villages and towns and farms and saying, I need a rabbit, and was taking kind of the runt of the litter, the smallest rabbits he could find. So they were cheap. They weren't going to be, food rabbits. A lot of them were already stillborn rabbits. And so he was just getting them as cheap as he could. And then as the point they're starting getting paid, it becomes much easier to afford rabbits. In fact, he bought 2 of them from a boy. One, again, was already passed from a litter that his rabbit had. Came back for another one, and he said, well, I'm sorry. I disposed of it. This other one passed away. He said, well, that would have done me just as well. So Joshua Toft is being very sketchy in all of this. And as I start to interview neighbors, it becomes quite the interesting record to read. It is unfortunate, and this is something that happened a lot in prisons and insane asylums of the time. And that was, she was put on display. They sold tickets to see her while she was in prison. And that, a lot of ways, prisons made money that way. And homes for the infirm or unstable or insane. They made money by putting their people on display, selling tickets and making it a show. And so Mary Toft was very good for business. I do find that obviously unfortunate because clearly there's some level of mental illness in this situation. And so she returns home and put in the goal there, acquitted, let go. Because while she cheated everybody out of their money, she paid for those rabbits. So this becomes a firestorm of media between all of these different physicians. Everybody's trying to clear their name. They are bailing the ship with buckets to get off. And so you have, Howard and St. Andre, and actually Ehlers accuses Howard of aiding and abetting. And then you have St. Andre, who ends up dying in an almshouse, completely penniless. Now, remember, he was a court doctor, but then he supported this. And so this is actually, that's up on the up here now. That is an unattributed sketch, and that plate includes that very first one is the poem I read at the beginning. So this entire 12-plate series is devoted to the story of Mary Toft, and that's a really interesting one if you get to read through it, and speaks to the kind of sensation that this story was. And a lot of them focus on the doctors and how they were so easily duped. So you have St. Andre, who's now lost all of his clients. Nobody has any faith in him anymore. How will he know how to treat me? What's wrong with me? When he thought this woman was giving birth to rabbits. So he goes from very high up to very low very quickly. And unfortunately, I don't have it with me, but there's a sketch or plate of St. Andre, and it's him looking very sad. And it's underneath it, it's called The Rabbit Doctor. So he ends up dying in an almshouse, penniless. Pros like William Hogarth, who are these masters of satire, join in because how could they not? This was easy fuel for their fire. This is absolutely my favorite one of the Mary Toft story plates. And this one's by Hogarth, and it actually was written and drawn for the sake of religion and some of the battles he was fighting there. But if you look at the bottom, in the bottom left, you'll see Mary Toft giving birth to rabbits next to this boy who is the boy from Bilson, or the Bilson boy, who vomited metal. So he put those on the same, and that again was found to be a hoax. And so she's put on the same level in this infamy. And so if you look at all the different satire that accompanies her, it's pretty funny. And so you have these different people that are masters of satire that are really harping on these doctors and these physicians who should have known better. This common woman who reportedly couldn't read, which is up for debate because it's said that she actually wrote a memoir before her death, but nobody's really sure if she actually wrote it or if that was written for her and about her. Then one of my personal favorite satire writers is Jonathan Swift, and so he's actually attributed to writing this specific, and I'll have to read it because there are a lot of words here, this specific pamphlet. Then it's the same year that he wrote Gulliver's Travels. But the doctor, Lemuel Gulliver, surgeon and anatomist to the kings of Lilliput and Belfasque, and fellow of the Academy of Science in Balnibarry, is the pseudonym. This is a pseudonym of his writings here. And in this, he does what he typically does. If it is a Jonathan Swift, but I believe it is, where he writes it like it is an official document, it is an official paper. So, and just completely dissects this. And it's actually called The Anatomist Dissected, and runs the doctors through the ringers. So Manningham comes out fine. He's the one who's exposed this whole thing. But Mary Toft is really the only one who dies with any fame to her name at all. So she dies and is infamous still on January 13th in 1763. And her obituary is run next to statesmen and royals as the mother of rabbits, or the rabbit breeder. So the story of Mary Toft is, like I said, it's an odd one. It's a little uncomfortable, but it took the world by storm. Fake broadsides were produced saying this was a deathbed confession and saying she committed suicide, which is a very common broadside to gain attention for people in that criminal element. It happens for several others that we know of. But through it all, the Mary Toft story kind of endures, even if the reputations of her physicians did not. So I want to thank you all for being here with me for this. If you like kind of the oddities, let me know. But we're going to definitely keep mixing it up. So make sure you subscribe to our channel between the hard history with the physical artifacts, the stories of the time that would have entertained the people that came before us, both here in America and abroad in England. All of those matter, and all of those make up the culture of the time. So thank you so much. And like I said, I'm Abby. Thank you for being in the study with us today. We will see you again next Wednesday at 4 p.m.